Keon ran like a madman across the freezing snow of the Canadian taiga forest, barefoot. By all logic, his feet should have frozen solid, but Keon kept screaming that they were burning. Each stride he took stretched over more than 5 meters, an inhuman distance. The footprints grew longer and longer, then abruptly ended, as if Keon had taken flight and vanished into thin air. This is not a werewolf. This is not a horned demon. This is not the creature Hollywood has sold to audiences for decades. This is the Wendigo. And its true transformation has nothing to do with claws or fangs. It happens from within, in the place where your soul once resided. Tonight, we will unseal the files that reveal what the indigenous tribes of North America truly feared, and why their warnings were never meant for entertainment. They were created to save you from becoming something that could never be human again. If you have ever watched any movie, television show, or video game featuring a Wendigo, you have been deceived. The monster in Antlers has antlers. The creature in Until Dawn has antlers. The versions in Supernatural, in Grimm, or Fallout 76 all share one common trait: a pair of antlers protruding from the skull, sharp claws extending from the fingers, a body nearly 3 meters tall, hunched and grotesque. A hybrid creature between deer and werewolf, stalking the deep forest and devouring anyone who dared set foot in its territory. This is not the real Wendigo. These films and games took a kernel of truth from the original folklore and buried it beneath Hollywood's gaudy horror aesthetics. That kernel is cannibalism. Yes, the Wendigo is associated with the consumption of human flesh, but everything else, antlers, claws, gigantic body, transformation into a literal monster, does not exist in the original legends. By turning the Wendigo into a physical monster, Hollywood made it something you could fight, an external enemy that was not yourself. And in doing so, they erased the true warning. They made it something safe to watch. The true Wendigo comes from the Algonquian-speaking tribes of North America, such as the Ojibwe, territory stretching across the Great Lakes region, and the Cree, the eastern forests of Canada. These were peoples whose survival depended on hunting in the harshest winter conditions on the continent. These peoples did not tell stories about monsters for entertainment. They told stories to survive. And their Wendigo looked completely different from what you have seen on screen. In the book The Manitou, Preserving the Spiritual Knowledge of the Ojibwe People, Indigenous author Basil H. Johnston described the Wendigo in terms that make one shudder, not because of fangs or claws, but because of what it represents. Emaciated to the point of gauntness, skin dry and stretched tight over bone, the ashen gray complexion of death, eyes driven deep into their sockets, lips torn and bloody, the stench of rot and decay emanating from the body. This is not a monster. This is a human who has lost everything that makes them human. The Hollywood version can be destroyed by a silver bullet. The real version is not so easily killed because its transformation is not physical, but spiritual. The body is withered, yes, but only because the soul rotted long before. Hunter Akacheta, an elder of the tribe, explained that the word Wendigo comes from the Anishinaabe language, meaning only for oneself. The Wendigo cares for no one else, no family, no friends, no tribe that raised them. The only remaining desire is to consume human flesh, and there is absolutely no concern for who must suffer to satisfy that craving. But this is what Hollywood never shows you. That craving does not come from an evil spirit possessing an innocent victim. It does not come from a curse. It comes from the thing we fear most: starvation. And what happens next is far worse than growing antlers. Winter in the Northern Territories is unlike any winter most people have ever experienced. In the Great Lakes region, in the forests of eastern Canada, temperatures drop to levels that can kill an exposed person in just a few hours. Snow buries the landscape for many months. Animals disappear into hibernation or migrate south. For the indigenous tribes living in these territories, survival depended entirely on what they had hunted and stored before the cold arrived. When the hunt failed, people starved. And when people starved long enough, some made a choice that could never be undone. An explorer named Jasper, captured as a child and living among the Ojibwe and Chippewa for 30 years, recorded this exact scenario. Jasper, who had earned the tribe's trust and was given the nickname the Red-Skinned White Man, wrote about a man in his hunting party who ate the flesh of his own wife during a winter famine. Jasper described this man as an ordinary man and a poor hunter. When food ran out, when the cold became unbearable, when desperation crushed everything else, this man killed and ate his wife to survive. The tribe wanted to kill him immediately, not because they were cruel, not because they lacked understanding of his desperation. They wanted to kill him because they knew what he had become. They did not act out of hatred or revenge. They killed him because they loved their own families more than they pitied him. It was an act of protection, an act of mercy for himself and for all those who would have been his next meal. Once you have tasted human flesh, you can never stop. The craving will consume you, your heart will turn to ice, and eventually you will turn on the rest of the tribe. This is the true horror of the Wendigo. Not a monster attacking from the deep forest, but a neighbor, a friend, a family member who has crossed a line that transforms them into something that can no longer be trusted. A Cree elder, the hunter Akacheda, in an interview preserved in ethnographic records, explained this transformation in words carrying the weight of many generations of observation. When a person falls into that state, he is no longer a normal human. He no longer cares how cruel it is. And over time, if he eats again and again, if he eats human flesh, he becomes numb. He no longer feels, and his heart becomes like ice. There is no compassion. There is no right, no richness of humanity. Flesh is all that matters. The heart becomes like ice. This phrase appears repeatedly in accounts of the Wendigo. The physical body wastes away from malnutrition. Yes, the skin turns gray. The stench of rot clings to the person because they are truly decaying from within. But the real transformation occurs in the heart, in the soul, in any part of a human that makes them care for others. That part dies first. And here is the most disturbing part. Once the craving begins, it will never stop. Not after one meal, not after being rescued, not after years of trying to return to normal life. The hunger remains, insatiable and eternal. The transformation is permanent. These stories were never meant simply to frighten people around a campfire. They were warnings, lessons passed down through generations. That no matter how desperate you are, no matter how hungry you become, no matter how certain you are that you will die without food, you must never eat the flesh of your own kind. Because if you do, you will never be the same person again. Your tribe will abandon you, or they will hunt you down, kill you, and burn your body to ash. Every part of you, your clothes, blood, flesh, and especially your heart, the object frozen that once beat with human warmth. Fire is the only way to truly kill a Wendigo because you cannot reason with it. You cannot appeal to its humanity. That humanity is already gone. But there is another layer of meaning in these warnings that many people miss. These stories also teach about conservation. The hunter's responsibility is not to kill more animals than necessary, because overhunting can push an entire tribe into desperation, a situation in which the unthinkable becomes the only option. The Wendigo is not just a monster, it is a consequence of greed, of poor planning, of placing immediate survival above the well-being of the community. And in 1910, a writer named Alurnan Blackwood published a story that captured what this transformation truly looked like. His account reads more like the testimony of someone who witnessed the horror firsthand than a work of fiction. The evidence he left behind awaits in the next file. The story, by writer Algernon Blackwood, published in 1910, is perhaps the fictional work that most authentically captures the horrifying nature of the Wendigo transformation. It reads like a testimony from someone who witnessed it firsthand. evoking fear not from a monster, but from the disintegration of humanity. The story begins with a hunting party venturing deep into the Canadian wilderness. 4 men set out to hunt moose after local hunters returned and declared their usual hunting grounds depleted of wildlife. The group included Professor Cathcart, a researcher, his nephew Liam on his first hunting trip, and 2 seasoned guides, the hunter Ronan and the guide Jock, close friends for decades. They also had a native man named Punch, responsible for cooking and maintaining the camp. After a day of searching without finding a single trace, the group considered exploring the far side of the lake where they had set up camp. This was when Jock's attitude changed completely. He did not explain why he was reluctant, only insisted that he was not afraid of anything in the forest. But his companions could see the fear in his eyes. Something about that territory terrified him. The next morning, the group split up. Ronan and Professor Cathcart headed west. Jock and Liam, the inexperienced nephew, paddled east across the lake. The journey lasted many days, pushing into increasingly remote wilderness. Liam knew nothing about survival skills. He depended entirely on Jock, who taught him how to read the terrain and how to find his way back to camp if they became lost. After another fruitless day of hunting, they set up camp as the sun set. The evening began pleasantly enough, eating rations, smoking, singing ballads around the fire. The 2 men enjoyed the wild surroundings. Then Jock stopped singing. His voice dropped to a whisper. Liam froze. Something was wrong. Jock stood up, sniffed the air, then pointed toward their canoe. His eyes widened. The blood drained from his face. Liam asked what was wrong. Jock denied everything, blaming the song for stirring bad memories. But his terror was unmistakable, and his denial only deepened Liam's confusion. What could be out there that frightened an experienced man like Jock this much? They went to sleep in the tent, lying close together for warmth and safety. A few hours later, Liam woke to strange sounds. The wind, the lake waves against the shore, and the sound of Jock sobbing, pressing the blanket into his mouth to stifle the noise. Liam tried to shake him for answers, but there was no response. Then he noticed Jock's legs protruding from the tent, exposed to the bitter cold, as if something were trying to drag him out. The young man covered himself and tried to sleep. He failed. A few hours before dawn, Liam was awakened by violent movement. Jock was trembling, curling against him, trying to move away from the tent entrance, as if something were waiting outside. Then a voice sounded, unlike anything Liam had ever heard. Harsh and commanding, yet strangely sweet. 3 distinct notes echoed from the darkness, calling out. Before Liam could process what he heard, Jock leapt up and ran out of the tent. His body moved as if he no longer controlled it, and then he screamed words that would haunt Liam for the rest of his life. "Oh, my burning feet, my blazing feet! Oh, my great height and fiery speed!" And then Jock vanished. Along with the voice came a foul, strange stench, the smell of something rotting. Liam tried to pursue his guide, but knew he was unprepared. He steadied himself with breakfast, took his rifle, and followed the footprints in the snow. What he found froze his blood. Animal tracks ran parallel to Jock's footprints, but Liam could not identify what kind of creature they belonged to. Stranger still, Jock's footprints were changing as he followed them. The strides grew longer and longer, impossibly so. The distance between steps stretched more than 5 meters. No human could run with such a stride. And the footprints themselves were transforming, growing larger and rounder, as if Jock's feet were becoming something else. Then the tracks stopped. Liam searched in every direction, shouting until his voice was hoarse. Then he heard Jock's screams coming from somewhere above him. In the trees or in the sky, he could not tell, screaming about his burning feet. He searched for hours. Nothing. When the sun set, he had no choice but to return to camp alone. The journey back was a nightmare. Every snapping branch sounded like the creature returning, Every gust of wind carried whispers from behind the brush. He felt watched the entire way. He made it back to camp in time to light a fire before total darkness fell. He kept the fire burning all night. The rifle never left his hand. The next morning, he paddled back to the base camp. He arrived at midnight, guided by the distant glow of his uncle's fire. When he told them what had happened, they were skeptical. They believed the tension of the wilderness had affected his mind, but they agreed to search for Jock. After Liam fell into a deep sleep, calmed by the professor's medicine, the other three crossed the lake. They searched all day without success. That night, around the fire, Ronan told them about the Wendigo. The voice of the wilderness made flesh, he said. A voice like the wind, falling water, the cry of animals. Once someone hears it, they are gone forever. Ronan explained, the most vulnerable points are the feet and the eyes. The feet for the desire to wander, the eyes for the desire for beauty. The poor soul runs at such terrifying speed that blood runs beneath their eyes and their feet burn until they fall off and form new feet identical to those of the Wendigo. The footprints Liam had followed. The transformation now carried a dreadful meaning. Then, without warning, Ronan stood and shouted into the darkness. Another voice answered from above. Jacques screamed about his blazing feet. Something heavy crashed through the trees. A thud, the crunch of footsteps on snow. A shape appeared just outside the firelight, moving like a puppet on strings. Jerky. Wrong. It lunged toward Liam, and he saw the face of Guide Jacques approaching. It's me, Boss Liam. The voice, but this was not Jack. The skin on his face sagged like a mask that did not fit. The stench of decay came in waves, as if something were wearing Jacques' face, and all of them were too terrified to see what lay beneath. Ronan, stunned at seeing his old friend, lay back in the tent but kept watching. When the thing resembling Jacques sat down, Ronan shouted, "My God, look at his feet!" Liam looked. Two dark, swollen masses where Jacques' soft leather boots should have been. Professor Cathcart rushed to Jacques, trying to cover his feet with a blanket, but Jacques' face twisted into something grotesque and he said, "You see it too. You have seen my burning, blazing feet." Ronan tried to chase after him. Professor Cathcart restrained Ronan, knowing he would share the same fate if he entered the darkness. A few seconds later, they heard Jacques' screams echoing above them, growing distant, fading into the sky. Then silence. The stench vanished. The only sound was the crackling of the fire. The next morning, they returned to base camp. Punch had disappeared, but lying beside the cold ashes was Jock. He was only a fragment of himself. His mind was shattered beyond repair. He could not remember the past days or his former life. His face was expressionless. No fear, no recognition, nothing. He did not know who was holding him, feeding him, speaking words of comfort. The part that made him an individual was gone forever. He muttered like a child about his burning feet. And this time, his complaint had meaning. His feet were severely frostbitten. His eyes showed signs of recent bleeding. No one knew how he had returned to camp. He had no canoe. He should have walked more than 150 kilometers around the lake on those damaged feet. Later, they learned that Punch had seen Jacques stumbling toward him. When Punch got close enough to smell that stench, he turned and fled. He completed the journey home in just 3 days, driven by the terror of his entire race. He knew what that smell meant. A few weeks later, with no mind or soul left to inhabit his body, Guide Jacques died. The wilderness had taken everything from him. But the most disturbing part of Blackwood's account was not the horror of Jacques' fate. It was the question that lingered in the minds of all who survived. Was this a supernatural possession, or something that could happen to anyone pushed to the edge? Psychiatrists would eventually provide the answer, and that answer might be even more frightening than any demon. The question remains after Jacques' disappearance. Is this a supernatural possession, or something that could happen to anyone pushed to the edge? Psychiatrists eventually provided an answer. And that answer may be even more frightening than any demon. The American Psychiatric Association, APA, officially recognizes a condition called Wendigo Psychosis. This is not folklore. This is not legend. This is a clinical diagnosis in medical literature. This condition is described as a severe culture-bound syndrome occurring among the Algonquian natives living in Canada and the northeastern United States. It is characterized by the delusion of becoming possessed by a cannibalistic monster, the Wendigo, and manifests through symptoms including depression, violence, a compulsive desire to eat human flesh, and sometimes actual cannibalistic behavior, actual cannibalism. The key phrase is culture-bound syndrome. The belief in the Wendigo is so deeply rooted in the worldview of these peoples that the very fear of becoming a Wendigo can trigger the transformation. Consider the implications of this. In 1879, a man named Solitary Runner walked out of the northern Alberta wilderness alone. His wife and 6 children had gone into the forest with him during the winter. When authorities investigated the camp's campsite, they found bones cracked open to extract marrow, skulls, the remains of an entire family. Solitary Runner claimed that the Wendigo had haunted him, that a demon forced him to kill and eat his family members one by one. He became the first person to be legally hanged in Alberta. But the question that haunted those who studied this case was a demon truly possessing Solitary Runner? Or had starvation and isolation broken something inside his mind, causing him to believe he was becoming a Wendigo, thereby driving him to carry out the transformation he feared? It was a self-fulfilling prophecy written in blood. The native people told stories of the Wendigo to warn against cannibalism, but those very stories, paradoxically, may have planted the seeds of the condition they were trying to prevent. If you believe strongly enough that cannibalism will turn you into a monster with an insatiable hunger, and if you find yourself desperate enough to commit that act, then the psychological horror of what you have done could truly produce the very symptoms you fear. An insatiable craving may be the way the mind processes extreme guilt and the violation of the most powerful social taboo. Loss of empathy, a heart turned to ice, may be a psychological defense mechanism. To continue living after eating one's own loved ones, the mind must create an emotional barrier, a numbness, so as not to face the horror of that act. Psychologists have noted Wendigo psychosis as a classic example of how culture can shape mental illness. In societies where the risk of starvation is real and cannibalism is the greatest taboo, the story of the Wendigo serves as a powerful mechanism of social control. During times of severe famine, any member of the tribe who displayed excessive selfishness, greedy hoarding of food for themselves, or began to have strange dreams and behaviors, early symptoms of Wendigo psychosis, would immediately be viewed with suspicion by the community. This tension and pressure from the community could push that person into a spiral of the disorder where they acted out their own delusions. This is the most horrifying truth about the Wendigo. Hollywood has turned the Wendigo into a monster so that you can feel safe when you look at it. You feel safe because you know you do not have antlers and you do not live in a cursed house. But the Wendigo is truly what frightens you when you look at yourself in the mirror. It is the question of how far you would go to survive and how much humanity you must sacrifice to do it. Greed and selfishness are the key. The Wendigo does not only warn against cannibalism after famine, it also warns against the behaviors that lead to famine, as mentioned in Idea 2, the hoarding, greed, and placing personal needs above the needs of the community. These behaviors are the very first signs of spiritual transformation, the beginning of solely for self. So, was Jock in Blackwood's story possessed? Or was he pushed to the brink in an environment he was unprepared to cope with, where the fear of the Wendigo, a story he had heard since childhood, automatically created a program in his mind? He was lost. He was hungry. He was alone. And when the strain reached its peak, His mind chose the most horrific escape, to become the predator rather than the prey. He did not grow antlers. He simply lost himself. Then, when he was found, Jacques was spiritually dead. He remembered nothing, showed no expression, no awareness. The Wendigo part, the part that needed to hunt and run with burning legs, had separated from his body and vanished into nothingness, leaving behind an empty shell that had violated the taboo. His physical death weeks later was only the end of a process that had already begun from within. Wendigo Psychosis teaches us that the greatest danger is not the monster that steps out of the forest, but the monster that is born from within us when all moral boundaries collapse. After delving deeply into Idea 4, we understand that the Wendigo is not a supernatural monster, but a culture-bound psychological reaction to extreme despair. This leads us to the final and most important of the story, the purpose of the existence of the Wendigo legend. Stories about the Wendigo were never told simply to frighten people around the campfire. They were warnings, lessons passed down through many generations, an inseparable part of the survival code of the Algonquian people. Their purpose was not entertainment, but to keep the community united and alive. Supreme social control tool. In the harsh living conditions of the northern winter, where survival depended on cooperation and the sharing of resources, such as hunted meat and stored food, selfishness and greed were deadly threats. If a member of the tribe hoarded food for himself or began to eat things that should have been shared, he not only put his own life in danger, but also threatened the survival of the entire tribe. The Wendigo played the role of the ultimate social control mechanism, preventing greed. This legend assigned horrific consequences to selfish hoarding behavior, transforming into a creature with an insatiable hunger, one that would be eternally isolated and hunted. This reinforced the tribe's core moral principle: community before the individual. Defining boundaries. It established an absolute moral boundary: never, under any circumstances, eat the flesh of another human being. Starvation was terrible, but becoming a Wendigo was far worse. This choice was permanent and irreversible. Anyone who crossed this line not only committed murder, but also committed a crime against humanity, excluding themselves from the human race. Consequences and purification. In ethnographic records, the tribe's response to someone suspected of having Wendigo Psychosis, or caught engaging in cannibalism, was not pity or criticism, but swift and ruthless purification. Hunter Akacheta emphasized, they killed that person not out of hatred, but out of love for the others in the family and the tribe. Once the heart had frozen, that person was no longer capable of recovery. The soul was dead. The only thing left was the craving for human flesh, a hunger that would direct that person toward the next meal, their own loved ones. Killing the Wendigo was an act of protecting the community and a final act of mercy toward the victim themselves, releasing them from eternal hunger. Burning the body was mandatory. Everything had to be reduced to ashes: clothes, blood, flesh, and especially the frozen heart. Fire was the only thing that could deal with the Wendigo, because you cannot negotiate with absolute selfishness. You cannot cure a soul that is already dead. Wendigo as an ecological and planning metaphor. More than a warning about personal morality, the Wendigo was also an important ecological metaphor. Resistance to exploitation. The Wendigo represented the consequences of unsustainable resource exploitation. If hunters became greedy, killed too many animals, overhunting, or hoarded excessively, they would push the community toward famine. Thus, the Wendigo was the consequence of ecological greed. This warning taught responsibility toward the environment, living in harmony with nature, taking only what was necessary for the community to survive. Personal responsibility. It forced each individual to take responsibility for planning and preparing for the future. Famine was a failure, and that failure could lead to Wendigo Psychosis. By linking selfishness, lack of planning, and cannibalistic behavior to a horrific entity, This legend ensured that people would do everything in their power to avoid all three. The change in the legend, what Hollywood got wrong. Hollywood and popular culture stripped away these deep meanings and replaced them with the image of a simple, easily understood, easily defeated monster. Characteristics: Algonquian legend original version, Hollywood popular culture version. Nature spiritual mental transformation, mental disorder. Physical transformation, deer werewolf hybrid. Appearance: gaunt, hollow, ashen gray skin, smelling of death. Tall, horned, clawed, muscular. Origin: greed and despair leading to cannibalism, psychological syndrome, evil spirit, curse or infection, external factor. Purpose: social, moral warning to prevent behavior. Entertainment and creating an enemy for the main character to defeat. Enemy: oneself, absolute selfishness. An external monster can be killed with weapons. By removing psychological and social complexity, Hollywood has sanitized, cleansed, made clean the story. They turned a tragedy of humanity into a horror fairy tale. The warning of the indigenous people was never intended to scare you with imagery. It was intended to save you from becoming something that could never be human again. Save you from moral and spiritual collapse. If you have ever been hungry, ever been tested, you will understand that the Wendigo is not just a legend. It is a latent possibility within every human when all social restraints are broken. We have unsealed the archives, compared the fictional Wendigo with the brutal truth from Algonquian legend, and explored the horrifying intersection between folklore and mental pathology. Now, let us synthesize what we have learned and draw out the eternal meaning of the Wendigo in the modern world. Summary of the truth about the Wendigo. The falsehood of the antlers. The Hollywood Wendigo is a physical monster with antlers and claws, created to serve entertainment and commercial needs. It turns the Wendigo into an external enemy, something you can fight and defeat, thereby diluting the real warning. Spiritual transformation. The true Wendigo is a human who has fallen into a state of mental and moral collapse, becoming gaunt, hollow, and exuding the stench of death. The transformation is not physical, but spiritual. The soul dies before the body. Origin in hunger and selfishness. The initial drive of the Wendigo is famine in a harsh winter. However, it quickly turns into an unquenchable obsession with human flesh, representing absolute selfishness, solely for self. The frozen heart. The transformation is characterized by a complete loss of empathy and humanity. The heart becomes like ice. The Wendigo is an internal threat, a loved one who has crossed the moral line, becoming an irredeemable danger to the community. Medical diagnosis. Wendigo Psychosis is a real culture-bound mental syndrome, where the fear of becoming a Wendigo can turn into a self-fulfilling prophecy, driving the desperate person to commit cannibalism and then become haunted by it. Survival code. This legend is a tool of social and moral control, teaching ecological preservation, communal responsibility, and establishing absolute moral boundaries to ensure the tribe's survival. It is a lesson in survival, not a story for entertainment. The eternal question: who can become a Wendigo? The fate of the guide Jock and the solitary runner raises the final question: what creates a Wendigo? It is not a virus or a magical curse. It is a moral choice made under unbearable pressure, then amplified by a powerful cultural belief system. In our modern world, we may not face cannibal famine in the taiga forests, but we face many other forms of hunger. Hunger for power, the limitless accumulation of power and influence regardless of the destruction of others. Hunger for material wealth, insatiable greed for assets, profit, and consumption, leading to the exploitation of natural resources and labor. Hunger for morality, the loss of empathy for others, the willingness to devour others, metaphorically, to advance or protect oneself. In any context, the Wendigo is a metaphor for the collapse of humanity under the pressure of greed and absolute selfishness. When a CEO lays off thousands of jobs just to increase personal stock value, is that a form of solely for self? When an individual hoards wealth while their community is struggling, Is their heart slowly freezing as well? The Wendigo teaches us that the monster is a choice. We are not turned into monsters. We choose to become them when we place our own needs above the survival and dignity of others. The permanence of destruction. Some boundaries, once crossed, cannot be returned from. The loss of the soul is eternal. Fire is necessary. Sometimes, to protect the community and oneself from moral decay, a total purification is required. The warnings of the indigenous peoples of North America were not meant to make us jump in movie theaters. They were created to warn us of a danger that never disappears, a latent possibility in the psychological DNA of humanity when pushed to the limits of existence. The Wendigo is not an entity in the forest. It is a horrifying echo from the frozen wilderness, a reminder that humans are capable of the most terrible destruction, not in the form of a horned demon, but in the form of a gaunt, hollow human being devoid of love. The archives have been opened. The evidence has been presented. The truth awaits. Every story is just another whisper in the dark. If you've experienced something truly terrifying, send it to Dark Whispers Audio. Let your story be told in the night. Subscribe now, for the darkness still holds many secrets.